In search of the sublime. But what exactly is the sublime? Generally speaking, the sublime is an aesthetic concept that is to be found in nature, when nature overpowers the individual and evokes terror and awe. An example of romantic art that captures the sublime is Caspar David Friedrich's most famous painting, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. In a work of aesthetic criticism dated to the 1st century AD, its author Longinus argues,
Nature made man to be no humble or lowly creature, but to be both a spectator and an enthusiastic contestant in its competitions. She implanted in our minds from the start an irresistible desire for anything which is great and, in relation to ourselves, supernatural.
Longinus' concept of the sublime regained popularity in the time of the Baroque and then again in the 18th century, when philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Edmund Burke introduced the concept into intellectual discourse. Regarding the effect of the sublime, Burke stated,
The passion caused by the great and sublime in nature is astonishment, and astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror.
As causes of the sublime, Burke lists, among others, terror, obscurity, power, vastness, infinity, and privation, such as darkness, solitude, and silence. The sublime is an aesthetic principle primarily linked to nature, but can it also be applied to modern cityscapes, or has it lost its relevance nowadays? For instance, are there places or experiences in Hamburg that may evoke similar emotions of terror and awe? What do these places usually represent to us, and what aspects of the sublime may they signify?
What is the first thing that come to mind when we talk about the harbor? Water, cranes, or ships? Harbors may be natural or artificial. The Hamburger port, however, as an artificial harbor, is an incredible mixture of nature and humanity. It is also a great place to track the sublime. In the 1st century, the concept of the sublime was first proposed by Longinus, and in the 17th century it had been rediscovered and became an important aesthetic concept. In order to track the sublime, people usually have to expose themselves to overwhelming forces like the boundless sea or gigantic ships. According to Edmund Burke, the sublime is that which has the power to compel and destroy us. The feeling of terror and astonishment are deeply interconnected with the sublime. In the painting Snowstorm, Steamboat Off a Harbor's Mouth, the romantic painter William Turner portrayed a ship off the coast struggling to persevere through a storm, which shows the overwhelming power and convey the feelings of terror and astonishment. When we are confronted by the berthed ships, the same feelings can be felt. Although those ships are so gigantic and seem to be impregnable, they are still vulnerable when they are exposed to nature's forces. Calm sea. Deep stillness rules the water. Without motion lies the sea. and worried the sailor observes. Smooth surfaces all around, no air from any side, deathly terrible stillness. In the immense distances, not a single wave stirs. Prosperous journey. The fog is torn, the sky is bright, and Aeolus releases the fearful bindings. The winds whisper, the sailor begins to move. Swiftly, swiftly. The waves divide, the distance nears. Already I see land. In awe of the sea, Goethe wrote these two poems. And later, in 1828, the famous German romantic composer Felix Mendelssohn composed the concert overture Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which is based on the poems. With this concert overture, let's start a short immersive experience of voyage. The pleasure of the sublime lies in the affirmation of the power of human reason in the face of something too big for us to grasp. Sailing on the canal, we might wonder where the end of the river is and think about the sea. But our senses are limited to representations of bounded objects. Faced with the infinite sea, our imagination struggles and fails, thus a sense of sublime emerges. As one of the best mixture of natural forces and human civilization, we can both experience the grandness of natural landscaping and human architectures in the Hamburger port. Human civilization like factories, railways, and bridges have greatly changed the natural landscape. The question is this a peaceful coexistence of mankind and nature, or is it our conquest of nature's forces?
While places like the harbor of Hamburg may impress one with their sheer size and grandeur, the fate of the city of Detroit shows how industrial areas may become obsolete and, robbed of their purpose, may eventually decay and become ruins. One of Hamburg's most popular ruins is the New York Hamburger Gummiwarenkompanie in Hamburg-Harburg. For over 150 years, this factory was used to produce hard rubber products such as combs for hairdressers. Today, despite having become an object of real estate speculation and a mecca for graffiti sprayers, the listed building has retained its Sleeping Beauty charm. But what does this have to do with the sublime? While previous understandings of sublimity had centered on magnitude and scale, claiming that the simple height of a mountain or endless expanse of an ocean, as for instance portrayed in Caspar David Friedrich's painting Morning in the Giant Mountains or William Turner's Fisherman at Sea, was the feature that inspired the emotional response, Edmund Burke argued that terror was the ruling principle of the sublime. In his short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, Edgar Allan Poe describes the terror viewing a building in decay, not yet a ruin, but in the process of becoming one and mirroring the decline of its inhabitants, may have on the observer.
I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant, eye-like windows, with an utter depression of the soul. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime.
Traveling towards the house, and thus forsaking the spatial distance, allowing for the taming of the terror evoked by the visual effects of the ruin through its aestheticization and rationalization, the spectator is gripped by terror and no longer able to enjoy the eerie beauty of the scenery. Similarly, the ruin of the rubber factory, with its empty windows, signs of decay, and its silence, evokes an eerie atmosphere that reminds of the feeling of terror associated with Poe's House of Usher, and thus, viewing the factory becomes a sublime experience. As the viewer steps inside the factory, the contrast between present dissolution and former glory becomes more apparent. This introduces the sublimity of time, as time seems to overwhelm the work of man. Simultaneously, the aesthetics of ruins involve a new unity, namely that of the work of man with the process of nature. Consequently, ruins can be defined as the disjunctive products of the intrusion of nature without loss of the unity that man produced. However, while the romantic ruin is often seen as a symbol of a previous life no longer in existence or a heroic past long gone, the industrial ruin represents a much more tangible facet of contemporary life, which displays the failing ideologies of the technological revolution. Nonetheless, both ancient and modern ruins show the mutability of time and the inevitable decline of humanity despite technological and industrial endeavors. Thus, ruins confront mankind with its own mortality, and this confrontation induces complex feelings of awe, loss, and melancholy consonant with the experience of sublimity.
Moving further into the city center, we find another space where humans are confronted with the transience of time as well as their own mortality: Ohlsdorf Cemetery. Cemetery gates, as shown in the painting Der Friedhof by Caspar David Friedrich, represent a threshold between our world and the domain of the dead. Friedrich captures the quiet and serene atmosphere most graveyards exhibit. Ohlsdorf, too, has imposing gates. As one enters Germany's biggest graveyard, an orange signpost reads, "Entrances are transitory." This points towards the liminal nature of not only cemetery gates, but cemeteries as a whole. They are not spaces of existing or for remaining, at least not for the living. Instead, they are places of remembrance, grief, and, for many, terror. According to Edmund Burke, death is the king of terrors, and, like Poe, Burke saw a strong connection between overwhelming terrors and experiences of the sublime.
Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is the source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling.
What could be more terrible than walking between sheer endless rows of graves, being reminded with each one that one day you, too, will end up in the ground, eaten by worms? The quiet contributes to the eerie atmosphere. One finds themselves alone with their thoughts while slowly walking along the graves. The presence of death presses closer, becoming more noticeable. Discomfort turns into terror, terror that can overtake you and make this place one of sublime experiences.
And mouldering as they sleep, a thrilling sound, half sense, half thought, among the darkness stirs. Breathed from their wormy beds, all living things around. And mingling with the still night and mute sky, its awful hush is felt inaudibly. Thus solemn nice and softened, death is mild, and terrorless as this serenest night. Here could I hope, like some inquiring child, sporting on graves that death did hide from human sight. Sweet secrets all beside its breathless deep, that loveliest dreams perpetual watch did keep.
However, the cemetery has yet another facet. It is not only a place of almost overwhelming terror, but also a space where the false dichotomy between nature and human society gets dissolved. In his poem, A Summer Evening Churchyard, Shelley depicts the graveyard not simply as a space of death, but also a place of life. While most humans in this space are dead, nature breathes all around them. In a way, cemeteries signify the ultimate union between human and nature, as decaying bodies become nourishment for the flowers, worms, and trees. Oldstaff in particular embodies these aspects with its wide and at times almost wild park areas. Thus, cemeteries create a space where people, poets, painters can experience nature in connection to life's transience. This place of death showcases the interconnectedness of all beings, living or dead. The combination of solitude, quiet, unity, and nature can thus create a sublime experience that stems from the realization of our own insignificance in the face of the cosmos.
The grave my little cottage is, where keeping house for thee, I make my parlour orderly, and lay the marble tea. For two divided briefly, a cycle it may be, till everlasting life unite in strong society.
Here, Dickinson touches upon yet another aspect of the graveyard, one that seems to speak against it being a place of the sublime. Death, like with Shelley, is not terrifying. Rather, it is portrayed as a way station between earthly life and the eternal afterlife promised in Christian religion. The grave itself is presented as a comforting space, a little cottage within which the dead await their salvation. However, Burke says,
When danger or pain press too nearly, they are incapable of giving any delight, and are simply terrible at certain distances. And with certain modifications they may be, and they are, delightful as we every day experience.
In other words, there must be a distance between what we perceive as terrifying and ourselves. Otherwise, it cannot be sublime. Maybe the grave as a home, death as a way station, creates that distance and allows the viewer to generate an experience that transcends everyday life. While Oldstaff is an active and well-kept cemetery, there are some graves that have fallen victim to the tooth of time. One day, the whole cemetery might look similar to what Caspar David Friedrich depicted in his pencil drawing of a monastery ruin in Aldana. Here, one can see the strong connection between the transience of human life and the way that, at the end of the day, all human creations will eventually become ruin.
And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
With these words closes Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, emphasizing the fragility of everything humans build. Nothing will last, neither the people themselves nor their monuments, which is likewise evident in Caspar David Friedrich's painting, where nature begins to reclaim the human realm. As Friedrich's painting demonstrates, ruins like this one are often left behind by themselves. Nature takes them back. At the same time, these ruins can be turned into monuments. Even if partly destroyed, they are preserved and incorporated in our daily lives. This photograph shows the ruins of the church St. Nikolai shortly after its near total destruction in 1943, with only the tower remaining intact. Located near the Rödingsmarkt in the city center, it is nowadays fully incorporated into the cityscape and functions as a monument for remembering what is lost and why. Ruins carry material agency and signify instability, breaking with our understanding of beauty. Much like graveyards, ruins convey an aesthetic of shock, horror, and decay, creating a sublime effect. The tall church tower overpowers the human that encounters it. First, by its sheer mass and scale, but, more importantly, because it is connected to memory, trauma, war, and loss. The ruin is a place of nostalgia for something that is long lost. In his novel The Marble Faun, Nathaniel Hawthorne envisions the Rome of the 19th century, where his characters take in the ruins of the city.
Muro Torto, a massive fragment of the oldest Roman wall which juts over as if ready to tumble down by its own weight, yet seems still the most indestructible piece of work that man's hand ever piled together.
And even though he writes about Rome, not Hamburg, the feeling of the partly destroyed wall about to fall over is the same, much like the grandeur and feeling of awe the viewer experiences looking at something not even a war was able to destroy. As the viewer moves inside the ruin, standing within walls that are no longer there, the memory of what is lost becomes more present. Hawthorne continues,
All Roman works and ruins assume a transient, visionary, and impalpable character when we think that this indestructible monument supplied one of the recollections which Moses and the Israelites bore from Egypt into the desert. Perchance, on beholding the cloudy pillar and the fiery column, they whispered awe-stricken to one another. In its shape, it is like that old obelisk which we and our fathers have so often seen on the borders of the Nile. And now, that very obelisk, with hardly a trace of decay upon it, is the first thing that the modern traveler sees after entering the Flaminian Gate.
But there's also the juxtaposition of the indestructible monument that Hawthorne mentions, and the very visible destruction of the church. In his painting, Imaginary View of the Grand Gallery of the Louvre in Ruins, French Romantic painter Hubert Robert likewise envisions the ruination of a grand building, which brings back the words of Ozymandias.
My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty and despair.
Once again, Hawthorne draws a connection between ruination and beauty, creating an opposition of loss and grandeur.
If we consider the present city as at all connected with the famous one of old, it is only because we find it built over its grave. A depth of 30 feet of soil has covered up the Rome of ancient days, so that it lies like the dead corpse of a giant, decaying for centuries, with no survivor mighty enough to even bury it, until the dust of all those years has gathered slowly over its recumbent form and made a casual sepulchre. Everywhere some fragment of ruin, suggesting the magnificence of a former epoch. Everywhere, moreover, a cross, and nastiness at the foot of it. As the sum of all, there are recollections that kindle the soul, and a gloom and languor that depress it beyond any depth of melancholic sentiment that can be elsewhere known.
Rome, the eternal city, is built on its own ruins. In the same fashion, the ruin of St. Nikolai, standing next to its own remains, is reminiscent of what is lost, the extent of which one cannot possibly fathom in its entirety, much like Hawthorne describes. The ruin in its sublime experience oppresses the viewer with its terror and grandness, towering over them.
Have you ever felt small in a big city? Felt tiny and insignificant in the midst of hundreds of thousands of other people, surrounded by buildings towering over you and reaching up into the sky? The origin of the term sublime is fitting for discussing these feelings. On a literal level, the Latin word sublimis means high, lofty, and elevated. That is why we are taking you along to two places that have this exact high and elevated nature, in both the literal sense and with a little twist. Can these places be the source of the sublime? In order to show what it feels like to walk through Hamburg, there is one simple solution that will give us a bird's eye view of the city, and that is the miniature wonderland. Here, impressive craftsmanship provides a unique view of places from all over the world. One section is entirely dedicated to the city of Hamburg. The intricacy and eye for detail is mesmerizing. The number of crowds on the streets, in parks, and people behind the windows of tall and small buildings makes one realize that one is never alone in a city like Hamburg. When walking through the miniature wonderland, it is easy to feel like a giant wandering around the earth. The perspective provided here is one that usually only belongs to the birds. It feels as though we're flying over the city, only that here we are not actually high up in the sky, but are standing on safe ground. The sublime can be found in things that entice terror and fear, but when a safe distance is added, we are allowed to admire the beauty of the exact thing that caused fear in us in the first place. Physically, we are giants in this place. And by feeling like a giant, we are forced to confront our position in the world. We are a small speck in a universe of such enormous size that it is difficult to wrap one's head around one's position in it. The realization of one's own physical insignificance, which is usually brought on by being confronted with enormous forces of nature, is emphasized in this place. The displays make the world look both small and big at the same time. It's so paradoxical. Edmund Burke used the term astonishment. Perhaps that is what best describes this feeling of shock and suspense, terror, power, and infinity that we feel here as visitors. At once tiny and huge, that is what the miniature wonderland makes one feel like. The next stop is one of Hamburg's most infamous buildings, the Elbphilharmonie. Reaching 110 meters, this is the tallest building in the city. From far away, we can already see the roof of the building, whereas romantic poets and authors were struck by the size and looming height of natural phenomena such as looming mountains and violent storms. In our day and age, in a city like Hamburg, we find this all in buildings. Percy B. Shelley wrote a poem about Mont Blanc, the tallest mountain in the Alps. So the words that Shelley used to depict what he saw on his journey in 1816 can be used again more than 200 years later to describe this impressive structure. Thou dost lie. And when I gaze on thee, I seem as in a trance sublime and strange, to muse on my own separate fantasy, my human mind, which passively now renders and receives fast influencings, holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe of things around. Far, far above, piercing the infinite sky, Mont Blanc appears. The Elbphilharmonie becomes our version of Mont Blanc. Admiring this structure from afar, perhaps we know exactly what Shelley felt like. With the Elbphilharmonie, this need to experience the sublimity found in natural structures is reflected not only in the size of the building, but in its shape as well. The roof of the building is one of the first things that is visible from a distance. The shape was made to resemble large blue waves. The sharp angles of the building add to the intimidating size of the waves and appeal to our natural fear of violent waters. With this mixture of awe and beauty, we make our way closer to the building. As we ascend the escalator, the world grows smaller and smaller beneath our feet, and we become taller and taller. The view from up here is stunning and not something for people who are afraid of heights. The platform is a mere 37 meters above the ground, but that is already enough distance to make everything else look small. People and cars look as though they could fit into the palm of one's hand. And even though the perspective is the same as in the miniature wonderland, the size of the buildings and river in the actual city are clearly superior to ours. Even though we are above the city again, physically, we are smaller now. From up here we get a similar view as we would from a tall mountain. We're no longer the wanderer above the sea of fog, observing natural wonders. We are now the wanderer above the city. Still thinking of the visual impressions from the miniature wonderland, the different perspectives are playing tricks with our minds. Are we still giants observing the city? How big is our place in the world, in the universe? The miniature wonderland and the Elbphilharmonie make us feel at once tiny and huge. Isn't that something both beautiful and terrifying? Through experiencing these two places in juxtaposition, more questions are raised than answered. One thing, however, seems to be certain. In the absence of natural wonders to force us to face the sublime, we will build structures to experience the sublime found in cities such as Hamburg today.
You know immediately where we are, at the Helmut Schmidt Airport in Hamburg. Although you are probably wondering why. Well, so far we have seen the sublime in various places and in different forms. The airport might be rather new, but should not be overlooked. This modern and technologically advanced place is filled with diversity. You might not think to look for the sublime in such a location, but it is there if you're willing to peer beneath the surface. The airport is filled with different people and emotions. We might not immediately see and know what these people are thinking, but we most likely have found ourselves in their situation before. A visit at the airport is always connected to a purpose. People have a reason to go to the airport. We could identify three perspectives: the visitors, the employees, the travelers. All of them regard their surroundings from various angles and therefore also experience other emotions. We will take a close look at the visitors and travelers. If you're a traveler, you might find yourself feeling anxious, stressed, and frantic. However, traveling for leisure and traveling for work are two opposite occasions. In moments like these, it is hard to spot something beautiful and positive in your environment. Negative emotions are still a part of the experience, but are often neglected as they cause discomfort. Nobody likes the stress, and so we try to escape it the best way possible. Another discomforting and terrifying emotion in this place can be fear. We all feel afraid at times and may even develop phobias of places, scenarios, or objects. The fear of flying will increase your discomfort and eventually gain the upper hand. Your journey's destination or reason does not matter. Your only present thought is your fear, which you are just trying to overcome and reduce. Are you afraid of flying? If you have this fear, you are surely not alone. You might struggle to overcome this negative emotion. Many people certainly do. But have you ever wondered why? Terror and fear of death are present feelings. You might not think about it, but it has crossed your mind at least once. Control is taken away from you, since you're not the one guiding the plane. Some people do not respond well to this specific situation and avoid flying at all costs. Another scenario can occur when you are simply a visitor at the airport. You might accompany a family member, a friend, or your significant other to say goodbye. The sad emotions which will overcome you are not caused by the airport, because the purpose of the airport as a means of transportation is to separate you and them. You might cry at the terrible thought of not seeing this person for a long time, or even forever. But the airport can also evoke positive emotions, such as the antithetical scenario of visiting to welcome people. This place can serve as a happy place for families, friends, or lovers to reunite. It is an exciting feeling to wait for the plane to arrive, or to sit in your seat in anxious yet joyful anticipation of this person's arrival. When you're traveling for vacation, the excitement doesn't start at the airport, although it can definitely increase this happy feeling. Check-in and baggage drop-off, the security check, the duty-free shopping, the boarding, the takeoff, as well as flying above the clouds and the landing all play a large part in your emotional state. However, you will most likely wait for your arrival and are presumably happy to leave the airport again, since the destination is the desired goal. Yet again, the airport functions as a way of getting a person from A to B. Even though you might experience the feeling of loneliness at times, the airport is a place where you will never be alone. The crowd follows you unconsciously in a way you will probably not notice. We have established that the airport makes us all feel various emotion at different times, and is experienced in a highly subjective way, depending on your perspective. Now we can take a look at the location itself. Even though airports are built rather far from cities, they don't really belong to nature. The magnitude of the whole area is nonetheless impressive and massive, with little bits of woods or other nature remaining. The magnitude of this place is similar to the idea of the previously mentioned high places, as you are a small part of a bigger picture, which you can never see in its entirety. Yet, when you take the time to observe the people moving like ants, you get a feeling of the greatness of this space and potentially realize you are just one of them. Every person is immensely small and just a part of the whole image. Another important and undeniable aspect is the progress and modernity you can find at this place. The modernized check-ins, security, but also airplanes, which become increasingly modern, often promising entertainment and even Wi-Fi on board. We never stop and take a moment to think about the contemporary, unless we are confronted with something we have not yet thought about. Flying and all the connected modernity accompanying the whole process are conveniences we often take for granted nowadays. It is a sign of comfort, but let's not forget it is also a sign of progress and of moving away from the natural state of humanity. Pondering the question of natural state and nature brings us back to the idea of the sublime in postmodernity. How can we find it? What does it look like now? Are we just unaware of our surroundings, or do we need to put in effort to come across the sublime to be able to grasp this? In Kant's philosophy, the sublime is the mixed feeling of pleasure and pain that we feel in the face of something of great magnitude and grandeur. We can have an idea of such things, but we cannot match up that idea with a direct sensory intuition, as sublime objects surpass the sensory abilities. An example of a sublime object for Kant would be a mountain. We can have an idea of a mountain, but not a sensory intuition of it as a whole. We feel pain at the frustration of our faculty's inability to fully grasp the sublime object, yet feel pleasure in the attempt to do so. The French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard extends the notion of the sublime from that which is absolutely great to all things which confound our capacity to synthesize them into knowledge. Thus, the sublime is situated at the difference between language games and phrase regimes. We feel the mixture of pleasure and pain in the frustration of not knowing how to follow from a phrase, yet feeling that there is something important that must be put into words. In Lyotard's postmodern philosophy, the sublime is the feeling that indicates the limits of reason and representation. The airport is a highly progressive, modern, and contemporary place. A sphere where diverse people and emotions come together and merge into a self-contained little cosmos of endless movement, departures, and arrivals. You can seem to feel the emotions the classic sublime is meant to cause, but that is only because you have learned not to confront them. The sublime can meet you anywhere. You just need to keep your heart open to embrace it.
In our search for the sublime throughout the city, we have found places of beauty, places of terror, and places that have filled us with awe. We have taken the time to experience these places, open to the emotions they might evoke within us. But have we found the sublime, as Burke, Kant, and others described it? The places we went to have made us feel humble, small, and yet they have made us realize that we are part of something that is bigger than all of us. If that's not sublime, then what is?